And good morning to everyone. I'm always happy to see new people, new friends, some folks that I've seen before. There is, I think it goes without saying, a lot to talk about. If you've been trying to make sense of what has happened and what you witnessed, not over just this last week, but this whole year, or where we were before, if it feels like you almost forgot if things were supposed to work this way, hopefully we can kind of tackle that today. But a little bit about the American Foreign Service Committee. Over the last 30 years, the AFSC has had the privilege and the honor of servicing communities all across the state. In this state, we only focus on immigration work, and so that has allowed us 30 years of experience, both in detained and non-detained contexts. So what that means is we work with families that are doing something as simple as a renewal of a work permit, and at the same time get to see people who are currently experiencing detention and deportation. And so that allows us on the legal end to be able to track a lot of really good data for everybody else to know, as well as, of course, the additional support that we provide through our social workers. We know that detention and deportation, it's not a single person who's being impacted. It is a unit of people, whether it's the community, the family, children at times. And so we also support everybody who is in and outside experiencing detention. And we also do effective policy initiatives that I like to think of as common sense initiatives, because they are. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of those are. I don't have much in this presentation about some of the driver's licenses, expansions, or anything else, but I'm also happy to tackle it if anybody has any questions. This is, I have to put the slide up because of the attorneys, obviously for educational purposes and not legal advice. If you do know somebody that needs legal advice, or if you have a legal question, we do have a great legal team that could also talk to you or anyone you know who may need it. There's a lot of things on the screen, and there is intentional. I usually have fairly bare uh, PowerPoint presentations, but I just want to give you a sense and just kind of walk through the bigger picture here. There has been to date 597 policy action related immigration issued by the administration. And I really want people to sit with this, because immigration at its core has always had a real relationship with the executive branch. But most, and for all of us, for the most part, when we talk about immigration reform or immigration changes, and I say this as somebody who works in the advocacy space as well as the policy space, we oftentimes think of Congress, right? Congress has ultimately the decision to fix a broken immigration system. But I think we learned one thing today as advocates, and that's that 597 policy actions is a lot. It is twice a day that you have something moving from beneath you. Every morning, myself and every other person working on immigration law and policy in this moment walks into a different reality. New things, things that you didn't even realize were still in the code after 100 plus years of immigration law being stacked on top of each other. And so, what that means is massive, massive changes. We're going to go through just some of the high level here, and this comes from our DC office. We do have an office that works in DC every day for our policy things, but something like the Asylum Cooperative Agreement, which is the third country removal agreements, unprecedented. This was not something that you could have before, that prior administrations even thought about exercising. This idea that you don't have to return to a national to their country of origin, but that in fact you can basically bribe your way through to get a smaller country. Most of these countries that are taking folks are very small islands in the middle of the ocean, or in different continents, that for $30 million will allow a specific set of folks to be detained there. And I want you to think about the legal problems and implications that that brings. Start to undo what would happen if somebody that you know ends up in a third country that they have no actual attachments or relationships to. Legally, it makes it incredibly hard for us to have a conversation about due process. And that's the big thing to think about when you think about here. What I am asking you to take away today is to understand that though all these are superficial changes to the immigration system, they are underlying significant changes to everyday American rights. All these cases are used as case law to then rip away other parts of our civil liberties. And that's why this is very important. As we have all seen, due process is being eroded on a daily basis in this country. I don't think that's much a topic of conversation now, as shocking as it was a couple of weeks ago. Definitely not where we were a year ago. And so the ability for the government to now be able to ship people out to third countries and decide and make deals that we are not privy to in their totality. I'll tell you that much. For these third countries and what they got in exchange for it and what protections people would have once we ship them, unknown. All factors that we find out as we go, as attorneys go on the ground. The travel ban, if you remember, first administration, we saw that there was a significant change of travel bans, but this is the extended version of the travel ban and not as much outrage. That's the other thing I also want you to think about patterns. And I don't mean that we're obviously a social justice organization, but it's also important for us to take account on how much has shifted in our perspective of what is and is not acceptable as part of our immigration policy. The people that are excluded include long-time permanent residents, commonly known as green card holders, visa holders, though we have started to see visa holders get detained once they enter the country. And for some places, now it costs you $15,000 that you have to give the federal government in order for you to use the visa you've been issued by the United States. And so that makes it less and less likely that people from specific countries will come here, even when they have business or travel to attend to. Family-based visas, that is a significant one. There are very few paths to citizenship, if any, currently in the United States. That is why we have a significant amount of people that are currently being impacted. The all in all, if you have to put a number to it, actual, fully 100% undocumented population in the United States. Strip away people with work permits, some kind of immigration process, can anybody guess, if you had to guess, how many actually full blown undocumented people do we have in this country? 2 million. Who said 2 million? Yep. You strip it all down, 1% of our population is basically who is fully undocumented. Yes. Because one of the other things that we have seen is the end of a lot of reunification paroles, like I said, includes countries like Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Haiti, Cuba. That expiration date that you have, it's basically their expiration date for being in the country. So what that means is that in about 3 days, folks from Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, Haiti, and Cuba have to make a decision whether they stay in this country or whether they return. Just for the sake of time, as far as periods of time in our American history, temporary protected status is a designation provided by the Department of Homeland Security that is given to specific countries because there's horrendous things happening in their country. The folks in Haiti got it after the earthquake because nothing was left standing, and so they were allowed to come here. Colombia, it's oftentimes due to the societal unrest. El Salvador, they had it after another significant civil war fallout. And that's the designation for the largest amount of temporary protective status recipients in the country. So what we are looking at is a systematic end of legalization, and I'll show you the stat for you to see it. But there's also a hold on all asylum applications. And that's another crucial thing for us to remember. Asylum is, in fact, a legal right that not just the United States, but every other country in the world is held to that standard. That if somebody is fleeing out of fear, another government doesn't mean they'll keep them in their country or will grant them asylum. It just means you're willing to be a safe harbor. One of the things that we are doing by creating these in between spots, I've been to DC and there's conversations oftentimes about processing centers outside of the US. It literally cleanses us from our international duty to have and hold the case of a person here. And so again, just important for us to remember that piece that we are in blatant violation of international laws at this point. The International Criminal Judicial Court has said so. That our immigration policies are things that should be looked at, and groups are starting to call the UN to investigate what's happening inside of detention centers. Again, there's many conversations happening at the state level and the national level, and I think sometimes how other countries are perceiving our movements are lost in the American media at times. The other thing to remember is that deportation flights, which are weekly military deportation flights, that's a new one. We didn't really use military planes to deport. They're not necessarily meant to carry people. Oftentimes, they are cargo size flights that are being taken out with very small room for people and a lot less accountability, harder to track. That's the other thing to think about when it comes to this. The reduction of validity periods for work permits. So what that means is that if you were in an immigration process and you were entitled to 5 years as per the law in immigration, well, there was an executive decision that was made that we want to tighten that down to 2 years. So now you have to do it every 2 years, even though there is a short staffing of people processing applications, and then there is, of course, an increase of people enforcing any minor violation of immigration law. And immigration law is still civil. That's another important thing to happen. If you had an issue with the EPA, they're basically telling you this is their solution to civil enforcement. And folks, we're also missing that massive reminder that it could be an EPA violation that they would justify what's happening here. It's just a matter of how much more it gets eroded. The proposed public charge rule, if people remember this from a few years ago, if these sounds familiar, basically what had happened is that a public charge rule is a designation that says that if somebody is going to be a quote unquote burden to the state, there should be a threshold. What had happened in years prior was a cleanup of that language to be a little bit more exact in what actually and who actually would be considered a burden to society. But they have removed that clarification, and so now it's fully down to the discretion of the officer in front of you. So that makes it less so that it's following the law and more arbitrary in a personal decision. Much of this is. Among the things that are missing here is the massive removals of judges, the introduction of military judges for the first time, um, and an overall feeling that there should be a little bit more of a punishing lens to our judicial law. The BIA, which is the accredited representatives for the attorneys, basically the ones who oversee the federal government, and all this is happening, just so you know, because our entire immigration system judicially falls under the Department of Justice. And so it gives a lot of unilateral power to the president to make choices down the line. They have lessened also the requirements to be an immigration judge. You do not actually have to be an attorney to be one. You can be a politically appointed person there. And so there is very little checks and balances in that. And that's a point of reflection going forward, right? Maybe, I don't know, maybe we consider changing and really ensuring things like due process. The last thing that happened within this past week that you might have missed is the pulling out of multiple international organizations. And so we're pulling out of, I think the list is 34 different international organization or bodies, some of which obviously intersect with immigration. But like I said, lots of things, huge stuff. What should you actually remember? I think this presents the best way of breaking down if somebody had to ask me three things that have happened that make you think differently about where we are in immigration. Right off the top, red alert. We have witnessed the largest delegalization effort in American history so far this year. A total of 1.65 million people have lost their immigration status. I said to you that at the beginning of the conversation, the number started at 2 million. I hope that you walk out of here realizing is that the intention is to make it much larger. We are having conversations about denaturalizing citizens already and having conversations about taking away things like green cards for very minor and prior convictions that clearly did not interrupt the flow of granting access because most of them are nonviolent. I also want to talk about our disproportionate funding for enforcement. We are at $175 billion. It is now in the same size and military and budget as other militaries around the world. This is again a civil private police force that has very, very rarely been held into any level of accountability. And again, we don't just say that because we feel that way. We know it to be true. I get the chance to sit in the Department of Homeland Security briefings, and when they do their testimony, where they're supposed to be held accountable, and there is very little accountability left. In fact, you have John Bovino, who many people have seen as like the top person for CBP. He's gone in front of Congress to try to explain away a potential. Um, there was a massive, well cataloged case of somebody dying under his protection, and that report made it to Congress a day after he testified. And that's because, and got appointed to this current position. And that's because it's hard to hold them accountable. Congress has the ability to carry out oversight at any given point at random. It is in the statute of the law. And yet, over the last year, there are less and less people in Congress who are able to actually walk into a detention facility and check in it. That is a violation of our congressional power as people who hold these representatives and vote for these representatives. And so that's a significant erosion in transparency that we've seen. And if you wonder whether it's intentional or not, you can walk into one of those centers and try to, with a congressional member, and see if they would be allowed in. From what we've experienced, they sometimes go as far as putting newspapers on the windows on purpose and covering them there in that moment so nobody can even peek in. If you've never been to the Delaney Hall Detention Center or to the Elizabeth Detention Center, which are the two detention centers in this current state, um, also a good thing for you to maybe go and see. I think part of this is breaking the mystery around it. These are places that you have the ability to visit and see yourself. Over at Delaney, there's a project outside called Eyes on Ice. And what it is everyday volunteers that are there passing things like coat or water or food to the families of people that are hoping to visit them, who are oftentimes made to wait for 8, 10 hours outside with nowhere to sit because there's no visitor area. So you're just out in a parking lot. And so people are able to do that every day. And I think that in those moments, I am reminded of why I do this work and why I fundamentally believe that everyday American people are phenomenal. They show up in solidarity in the most unique ways. The other thing to remember is that that is just the funds for enforcement. There are additional funds that are giving for other things, like detention capacity. We are currently witnessing the largest capacity in history with approximately 70,000 people being detained, 73% with no criminal convictions. And that's, again, very important. There is such thing as there is such thing as too much enforcement, and there is such thing as too much capacity. I just want to give you a sense that the idea of what we have, the scale of what this could look like, it's anywhere between 200,000 to maybe 150,000 people detained. That's what we can make out for the intentions of private facilities. But we've been alerted that there's an intention to create larger capacity, 80,000 people warehouses in different parts of the country where they feel that they have the space to do that. In addition to our biggest concern, and I'm sure you've read about it a little bit, and it kind of leads into our next PowerPoint slide, which is the potential use of military sites also presents a massive legal question for anyone looking at this work. We don't quite know what access any attorney, advocate, consular protection service would have if they move into military bases. And New Jersey is basically a floating military base for the United States. And so New Jersey is expected to be one of the epicenters of detention. And that's why this also really hits home. Maybe folks have seen in the news the Roxbury uh, potential jail and the amount of residents that have come out of the past week saying that they do not want a detention jail to be set up in Roxbury, New Jersey. And folks are also monitoring Bliss, Dixon, Dix, because there's potential plans to set up people there. We did it during the Afghanistan refugee folks that were coming, and so they feel that they have experience enough to consider expanding detention there. So, what does this mean in New Jersey? Well, it means that we have seen about 5,000 residents so far be detained. That is a 110% increase from last year alone. There has been the one reported death over at Delaney Hall. I think I think it was about a month ago. At this point, it feels like a little bit of a blur, but Jean Brutus Marcus is the gentleman who unfortunately died. There has been significant medical emergencies called into the Laney Hall. Many of these places did not have a medical unit, despite what they say on record. And we have to remember that, of course, these are for private entities. The point is to detain, the point is to house, and they try to cut on every single dollar that they can by sometimes making the people that are detained there work for as little as $1 a day. And so they clean up the facilities, they do the day to day, and of course, it allows them to make even more profits from that. There is a 400% detention capacity increase that has gone from the 300 detention cells that we had at the beginning of the year to 1,200. Again, if it feels like it happened out of nowhere, it's because it did. The folks over at Delaney Hall were already setting up before they really had any approvals. And so there's ongoing litigation about the transparency of this bidding that happens as a whole. And I'll give you one set of good news and then other good news. But the good set of news is that up in Union, there was another jail the Union County Jail that was going to go for ICE enforcement, and local residents as well as folks from around the advocacy space got him to push back, and the county commissioners are back down from it. And so that really matters because that number was going to look more like 2,200 that I was going to show you today. And it goes back to saying that these are all the things that we remember that we can quantify. But the one thing that I cannot put in a slide or quantify is also the amount of pushback and the amount of solidarity and the amount of kindness that people have shown towards the immigrant community in this moment. And so, what can you do? You can join local coalitions, of course. You can support immigrant server organizations like, and of course, I am biased, the AFSC. Like I said, we do a lot of legal work as well as policy work, as well as just the caring for our community as a whole, because we understand that the numbers as to why we need to care are actually fairly simple in the state of New Jersey. 1 out of 4 residents is an immigrant. You cannot throw a pebble in the state without finding somebody that's being deeply impacted by this. The number of residents that have some level of immigration status or an immigration status process or formerly in an immigration status, that's why denaturalization matters. Many folks were naturalized decades ago. They can't begin to tell you where their paperwork is or quite what the details of that case and or law was that they gained immigration status from. Getting a receipt notice from the USCIS, which is the agency that oversees applications, it's thousands of dollars that you have to spend. People spend right now between $30,000 to $40,000 to try to get somebody out of detention, and you still most of the time cannot. And so for me, this is also a conversation about the economic instability that we are creating in our state. New Jersey is the benefactor of some of the largest amounts of immigrants who are also part of our healthcare system. Lots of reliance on things like home care aid as well as nurses. And one of the other things that we have in our state a lot of is DACA recipients, which are Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival, young people that came to the country and were given some kind of permit under the Obama administration in 2012. Most of those folks work as teachers and nurses. And so, what an immigration um, mass deportation effort would look like in our state, it would completely destabilize our healthcare industry, our farming industry down in South Jersey, and our teaching industry. These are the top 3 things that we will see suffer as a result. But here's the good news. I promise there will be some, and there are. If you want to know what you can do, like today, you leave today or tomorrow morning, you wake up and it's the first thing you got to do, and it will mean something. It is asking your state representatives. Here in New Jersey, we are doing something about it called the Safe Communities Act, the Privacy Protection Act, and the codifying of the Immigrant Trust Directive. Tomorrow, it's the floor vote. This is it. We either get these protections for all of us or we don't. And it's going to happen. So if you see it on TV, you know what this is. The Safe Communities Act to me is basically the designation or the redesignation now as official policy of the state of New Jersey that the Department of Homeland Security for the longest time since 2011 carried. What this means is what we most Americans knew as common sense immigration enforcement. And that meant do not enforce in areas like schools, healthcare facilities, domestic violence shelters or youth shelters, or any other sensitive areas where we are all mingling with one another and are just hoping to get services. A food pantry should not be a target of enforcement. And so the Safe Communities Act puts it into place to say that that is the line in the state of New Jersey, that we do expect some semblance of societal respect and just ability to thrive as a community by ensuring that our neighbors who are hungry can get the services that they need. Our neighbors who are seeking shelter or who are seeking some kind of care can get that. And again, I'll say that this is a conversation that I have not just with immigrant communities, but providers all across the state. This year alone, I think I've trained close to 300 providers on what to do if immigration enforcement is on premise. And you would be shocked. There are a lot of our food pantries across the state, a lot of domestic violence shelters that are concerned about the lack of reporting or willingness to cooperate with police out of fear of retribution from ICE. These are all people that are just seeking the most basic things, taking their kids to school. Lots of schools are getting that phone call every morning. Trust me, I hear that from teachers. about whether or not their kids should still go to school, whether they should ride the bus, whether they should walk to the store, whether they need to just completely isolate and protect themselves. The second one is the Privacy Protection Act, which really is a benefit to us all. One of the things that comes as a result of what we're witnessing in immigration is hopefully our larger understanding of the role that the Department of Homeland Security and really old bills like the Patriot Act play into their ability to surveil everything, and I mean everything. There's an increase of automatic license plate readers in every corner that you might be seeing more and more often being talked about. And all of that, of course, gets somehow connected to immigration enforcement as well as just immigration as a whole. And those things matter. There's a reason why when you tell somebody to register for a state ID, you want to at least be able to vouch for the protection of that information. This isn't even like an immigrant only bill. This is a privacy protection bill that does benefit immigrants in some way, but it really protects all of us from being able to have our information just blatantly without your permission. You have the permission to write, I don't care, use my data and share it willingly. You just have the choice now to say, I would rather you not until I think it's important for them to have it. None of these provisions in any way, shape, or form contradict federal policy. So that's a big thing to know. This is all within our our ability as a state to decide also the fate of some of our programs. And last but not least, I think one of the most important pieces of legislation, well, directives that we benefited since 2018. The reason why you're not seeing every single local and state police act as immigration enforcement in the state of New Jersey is because of that 2018 memo that the then Attorney General put into place. That memo in 2018 basically said one thing as a whole, which is in the state of New Jersey, we think that local and state law enforcement should continue to use the resources for local and state law enforcement. What that means is that we are not deviating our resources from enforcing everyday things that they do into immigration enforcement. And there's plenty of good reasons as to why, both legally, factually, and also just societally. One of the reasons why I am a strong proponent of creating that division is because states that have taken it upon themselves to expand enforcement by letting their agents be used, and in the state of New Jersey would be 33,000 officers that would be deputized overnight in order for them to carry out enforcement, including school resource officers. And that's why this bill is such an important part. But in those states, you have seen millions, multi-million dollar lawsuits on the violation of the Fourth Amendment right. And what happens is that the Department of Homeland Security backs out always when they actually have to cash the check, because then it's suddenly your officer's fault, your local officer and your local municipality's fault that the officer didn't really have the proper questioning, they didn't follow the proper protocol, but at times they get their training waived in this rush to get them to cooperate with immigration and make them feel like they don't have to do much. And so you're waiving training, you're allowing them to carry out new deputized rights. And then when the lawsuits inevitably come, and they inevitably come, then you have massive multi-million dollar lawsuits. In New York, which is, I think, the current example of this year, I believe that the fund is for over $200 million in Suffolk County, who decided to eagerly try to act as immigration enforcement, and within a matter of days had detained U.S. citizens in ways that they shouldn't have, broken protocols, taken to court, and now the county has to pay out $200 million. This is a diversion of your tax. It is the version of local resources at a time when the federal government is already tightening budgets across the country. And so to me, it's just the misuse of funds altogether, and an important distinction to ensure that victims of crime can continue to also pursue justice, and so that we're all better and safe off. If you don't get people to go to court and testify, if you don't get them to stand up and pursue justice, we all lose collectively. And so last but not least, this is the other work that we do. We do an ICE tracker activity. So that's for a lot of our service providers to ensure that we understand or know when there is immigration, if there's immigration enforcement at a school and so forth. There's a detention legal service hotline, which is put together by um, a number of providers in the state that do calls for people, or at least intakes for people once they are detained and have no legal representation. There is an unaccompanied minor hotline, New Jersey has a significant amount of youth that are considered unaccompanied minors. And I say considered because sometimes they do have family members. It's just that in the immigration very narrow box, they're considered unaccompanied. But they're making it harder for people to be able to claim those children if you have an aunt or a cousin or somebody who is related to you, because now they're asking for DNA sampling. And of course, that makes it a lot harder for people to want to step into that role, because if they don't have permanent immigration status, it could ultimately mean that by claiming a young person, you're self deporting or putting your entire family or housemates at risk. So, very disheartening. And there's also an unfortunate hotline that they're setting up internally for people to report unaccompanied minors. And so, again, there's this very deliberate tracking down of people. Immigration questions, that's I think the most important hotline that you can get, that 732-902 number. Because if you know anybody that has an immigration case, a friend, somebody you care about, you just have a question in general, our paralegals answer questions at no cost, 1 to 4, and that hopefully saves people an entire attorney visit if they have a case and they just have a processing question. Know your rights cards. I think I have some in my bag, but we've been recommending that people have these forever. These are just your constitutional rights in a red card that you can carry with you, that you are able to present to any officer, both federal or state. And with that, I will leave it for any questions or to expand on anything else anybody may have a question. Yes. One O would be for the Immigrant Trust Directive. So it's 6808, 6809, and then, sorry, 6308. I mistyped there. 6309 and it's 6310 for the directive. Same one. It's just the assembly matching. 6310 for that one. Yep. I'll fix it right now. Yep. I'll put them all up in there. Yes.
What is the status of the DACA deferred action childhood arrivals situation in New Jersey?
I'm happy to explain. So DACA is currently in a holding pattern all across the country. What that means is that where we are from it as a whole, big picture, and then I'll give you New Jersey because it really matters where we are in New Jersey. Big picture as a whole is that most DACA recipients from around the state are breathing a little bit, I think, easier knowing that our state attorney general, Matt Planking, about 2 years ago, decided that the state of New Jersey was going to make the counterclaim to the state of Texas. So, what the case overall hinges on is the state of Texas in 2017, 2018 decided that I'll give you the. Do we have enough time? How much time do we have? 5 minutes. I'll take 5 minutes to explain because I think the politics is very interesting in it. Basically, what ended up happening is that the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival program, or the DACA program, ranks highly as one of the most important and likable programs for the American public. 82% of Americans, including Republicans, strongly believe, and it's a bipartisan effort in the federal level, believe that DACA recipients should be given a right to stay. On average, DACA recipients have lived in the US for 20 years now. They were about 18 years old or 16 in most cases when they first got their protection from deportation granted, and have now come to be in the age of 30, many homeowners. If you were to look statistically at the group, what makes up statistically an average DACA recipient, they're more likely to work in healthcare or in teaching and education. And they are also more likely to have college degrees, because that is the whole intention of obviously having some part of status for a lot of young people was so they could study higher education. And so what has happened is that in 2017, quickly after the election, then Attorney General, well, still is, Ken Paxton out of Texas, basically put out in the media this challenge to the Trump administration, because a year had gone by. There hadn't really been any action against DACA, even though that was a core campaign promise. Said, if you don't have anything done against the program by August of 2018, we will sue the federal government. And what that was going to do is put the Trump administration in a once and for all on the court, really nail them down whether they were pro or against the program. But even in this administration and the prior administration, the DACA program has been treated with some semblance of concern or maybe a little bit of distance because they know that so many people in the American public are in favor of it. So what ultimately ended up happening is that we and I and other people were waiting to see if the Trump administration was going to concede, and they did. They didn't wait to get sued. They instead ended with this memo under Attorney General Jeff Sessions that said that DACA was no more. And it was out of the concern that Texas had that DACA recipients were a burden on their state. And so for a long time, that was the state position, and the federal government under obviously Barack Obama and under President Biden was that that was not the case. However, when the administration changed their position to be anti DACA, that's when the state of New Jersey intervened and said, Texas does not get to dictate and tell us how DACA impacts us because they wouldn't know. And the state of New Jersey went out to make a case in which they explicitly stated all the way in which the 22,000 DACA recipients in the state contribute and benefit. And so what we have now is obviously went to the Supreme Court. It was found that the way in which the Trump administration had ended the program did not coincide with the Administrative Procedure Act. And what came back down was this new chance to rewrite how the DACA program ends, specifically for DACA recipients in Texas. However, there is a clause there that allows the Department of Homeland Security to sue for the end of the program in the totality as a whole again, if they so choose to. But for now, we are just waiting to see how they cut the protection from deportation and the right to work away. So what that essentially means for a DACA recipient in Texas is that they are counting down the days, maybe sometime this month. We expect it before the spring, so that would be before March, that Judge Hainan will make a ruling explaining to 90,000 DACA recipients who currently call Texas home, second largest district for DACA recipients out in Texas, that they need to leave and they have a date to leave by. And so that is going to create massive economic instability in the state of Texas. I want to be abundantly clear that even in the states that on late night TV, you may hear their politicians go to bat for anti immigrant rhetoric. That is not the rhetoric on the floor. It is very unfortunate to say that behind closed doors, many of those people who are anti immigrant will sit down and tell you that they need to do something and fix something, that they actually need more people to be there to carry out the work that's needed. I sat down in September at a private conversation. It's a couple of dozen people, many industry leaders that go there. And one of the gentlemen that was there represents one out of every 10 jobs in America. Think about who that attorney must represent as a whole collectively. And what he said is, we are in a regression as far as our population goes. There are farms, dozens of American farms of working class people whose land is going to have to be given back to the government or bought out by private corporations because they simply do not have the people to keep that farm running. Dozens of farms a day are closing in places like Texas. Dozens of farms a day. We are seeing the largest suicide rate amongst our farmers in America. And one of the things that really disturbed me deeply personally, as somebody who cares about equity as a whole, not just towards immigrant populations, was the amount of money they were giving to immigration versus farmers. They only put $10 billion out for our farmers. There's 175 billion waiting. And so much more, because this week in DC, they're discussing whether they should give $4 billion more on both ends of the aisle to detention or deportation. And so to me, I think immigration actually serves as a perfect petri dish of just how far away we are from what local people want to see in everyday America and what our politicians want us to have as a reality in America. Different days. We are living in fear. They are living in different places where they think that this is, for some people, they really do think this is the greatest era in American history, especially in the context of immigration. And so I think that we have a choice to make every day. I really do. Whether or not we protect this country, I still think that the American experiment, there's a reason why it's the most radical thing that anybody can find. And it's because it really would be that unique to create a place where anyone from anywhere can come and make their dreams come true. And that takes work. Yes.
You gave early on in your talk a percentage, about three-quarters of the detainees have no conviction.
Yes.
Now, if you were to include in that population of detainees those that are here illegally,
even lesser than undocumented immigrants interact less with the criminal system than native born. They're actually more likely to be a victim of a crime than they are to commit a crime. I think the number of people that you probably would have in a roster who have committed what we would consider like significant like felonies probably sits at less. Simply being here illegally, which 2 million. Maybe I'm wrong. Is that a crime? It's never been treated as a crime. It is being treated as a crime. Yep, it would be 2 million people. So take that population. People never commit crime, never being committed, just here illegally. What would that percentage be? 2 million. Yeah, what would the percentage be of the detainees? What percentage of detainees would include those categories? All of them, because yeah, because they would all be in some semblance of immigration status prior to that. Would be persons that either are held committed a have other than just being civilly. Yep. And so that's why, I mean, again, I think that it's important for us to also remember the intentionality behind making more people undocumented, because that's what justifies the increase in funding. If the problem isn't getting bigger, then why are the resources getting bigger? But if the problem is larger, then there is a need for you to have more access to it. Yes, and then yes. It would strengthen our protections around our embassy data specifically, which is a massive win. um, Around embassy protection, yeah. But then the other thing that it does is it adds an additional layer to protection for things like healthcare information as well, in a lighter sense, but it exists as well, right? Again, I think that this is an unprecedented moment for a lot of state legislatures. I sense that every time we talk to them. I sense that anywhere that I go. This is a new time for states to really find also their standing on immigration as a policy, not so much just as a feeling, right? For a long time, there are a lot of welcoming states in the country that do understand the benefits of immigration, that speak to the benefits of immigration, and the economic mobility that comes with it. But a lot of the privacy protections were just kind of treated as afterthought, because we didn't think they were really going to use and exploit every backdoor that they have to pull immigration data. The reason why it's for every New Jersey resident is because, on average, 7 out of 10 Americans have had their information go through the Department of Homeland Security immigration database. They don't have to opt in for it. 7 out of 10 American citizens, people that live in America as a whole, which of course includes citizens, a majority, have had their information counter checked for citizenship against the Department of Homeland Security database. And that's just because of all the different ways in which something as simple as your insurance will sometimes leave or sell your data to somebody else, and they coordinate all this data, and they're able to get a better sense of your immigration status or not. Yes. The protections as to how they obtain it, right? If it's one of those things where it's a third party and the bill specifically puts additional protections around embassy data, then the agencies and their designated commissioners would have to review the privacy protections that they currently have in place and see where there might be leaks, and then protect that data even more. Yes. A lot of that is honestly something that we suspect, but we are in the process of getting a lot of FOIA information back for. Part of this is a cat and mouse game, right? I think that's how you get it, but unless you're willing to tell me how your operations work, then I don't know. And they are not willing to let you know how their operations work, because when they do have cases like that, the Department of Homeland Security is far more inclined to drop the case and just pay outright on the side than really tell you how it is that they went about getting that information. And so that also presents transparency. It's obviously like a key thing I keep going back to, and that's because it's less transparent for all of us, not just some of us. Yes. For the Safe Communities Act, I believe that they have 180 days for the attorney general would have to make their recommendations first, and they're giving them 130 days, 180 days, so that's 6 months, and then it would be a matter of implementing. The real time where it would probably be good to go would probably be either end of the year, if not at the beginning of the next year. For the privacy data, because it also includes this individual agency reviews, they're also looking at a year implementation timeline. Yes.
Yeah, excellent presentation.
Thank you.
It's great. Would I have permission to put a petition out for a New Jersey resident who's been held in ICE detention since March in Texas?
A lot of things go into that. We can have a conversation about it. I'll just explain as to the why in general. Oftentimes, that's one of the reasons what I think makes the work a little bit challenging. There is a discrepancy oftentimes between the way that attorneys see immigration law, because it's just a rubber stamping mechanism, versus obviously some of the changes that we're seeing right now. So, what that essentially means is that for anyone in detention who wants to have a public facing campaign or community support, the first step is always to talk with the legal team that they have. Some attorneys don't want to get involved in high profile cases because they fear the retribution that comes with it. That's a real calculation that folks have to make. And so I would talk to their legal team and see how they feel about it.
I have talked to them. This is Amnesty International. They've
Nice.
totally approved this petition. They wrote the petition.
I
They
love that.
verified everything. And I'm just asking if I can put it on the table here for people to
Yeah.
sign up. Okay, thank you.
Nope. Yeah, I would say that was.
It's her presentation.
I'll speak with you after.
Yes.
Are county jails in New Jersey, specifically Monmouth County, accepting detainees from Homeland Security?
There is something called the 287G, which I didn't put in here. It gets a little into the weeds, but the top line there is that in the state of New Jersey in 2018, one of the other things that we said we were not interested in was taking money for detention expansion. Again, their carrot is we will give you money if you let us use your facility, resources, staff, and all that. Um, but if you want to create a division, then it also meant saying no to taking any funds. So what is happening in the state now is that we have people that still get notified by law enforcement once they are released to be taken to immigration processing if they are in their crime falls under very specific list of crimes, which are a lot of like felony, serious crimes is when they turn them over. Do we have to do that as a state? There's two different theories on that. There is always an understanding that for some people, the punishment is serving their time in jail for the crime. And so when you remove somebody out of the country, they're not serving their criminal conviction here. They're just being shipped out. Again, sometimes not to their country of origin, sometimes to a third country. And so there are prosecutors around the country who don't agree with that because what they feel is that if you've committed a crime in the jurisdiction you committed it in, you got to serve your time in that jurisdiction. And then we can have a conversation at the end of that sentence about whether or not you get processed for immigration matters. There are other legal scholars that dispute that sequence of events because they don't believe in double jeopardy. So that's where a lot of theory of like if you served your criminal conviction, but your civil and enforcement, your failure to be here lawfully residing shouldn't have to then set you down for a deportation proceeding. Those are constitutional questions that I will leave to the experts to decide. But all that to say, in the state of New Jersey, we currently do not allow our jails to be holding facilities, and we do not allow them to uh, really enforce in that mechanism. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. That's also a fact. Um, but it means that that's why the directive needs to actually be codified, because the only way for us to know who is or is not abiding by it is by having a law to ask. The one time the Attorney General put out a report was about 3, 4 years ago, maybe, saying that police departments in the state of New Jersey were not cooperating. But after that, there has been less information coming out. So by having some kind of thing in the books, it would allow us to ask our representatives to ask for more direct information about our collaboration with law enforcement. I don't know if the report is out, but some folks were working on a report to talk about just how often it's actually happening. And there was a really good piece that one of our attorneys wrote that I'm happy to maybe circulate to you, Eric, for people that want to see it. about a particular case in Monmouth County where U.S. citizens were being referred to immigration purposes by being in the jail because of their last names, is the allegation. Yes. In favor of all three bills. So there's an interesting dichotomy, I think, specifically to the sheriff, law enforcement end, and then our other ends that are should be aligned. That's for sure. But again, we know that if people don't feel safe to call the police, they're not going to call the police. They're not going to cooperate as witnesses of a crime. They're not going to pursue justice. Some of the testimonies that our team submitted for safe communities and privacy protection. For safe communities, it was a gentleman who was a victim of domestic abuse, who it was not until he got hit with a machete multiple times that he decided to flee to a shelter. He didn't call the police because he was afraid they were going to take him to ICE. And that was the threat his abuser held over him for years. And so we were just lucky that the third safe space was a shelter, who of course did have the right training as to how to take care of the resident. And they're still afraid. They didn't want to go pick up the police report. They didn't want to go to court. They just kind of wanted to let it drop because they don't want to interact in the court system because immigration is in court all the time. And then the second case was a woman who was also suffering from domestic abuse. And even though it had been going on for years, it obviously got worse because you're an extra vulnerable person right in this moment. Somebody threatens to call the police. This is a real scenario currently. If somebody calls the police, even if you are the victim of abuse, but the abuser lies when the cops come, which happens all the time, and says that you are actually the abuser and you started it. If you are the person who has been the victim of abuse and you are undocumented and you are detained by police, you do not get your day in court. In this best case scenario that we're trying to win for our state, you still do not get your day in court where you get to prove you were not the abuser. You would just be deported. And so that's why it's a conversation to me about due process at the core versus anything else. Like if they are saying you are guilty of something and you don't get to prove that, it has ramifications for you immediately, obviously, because it merits your deportation automatically. It also means indefinite detention, but it also means that if you were ever, let's say you have a child who's a US citizen and 20 years down the line is able to petition you, you would not be allowed to have family reunification as a result of that one mishap 20 years ago, because any and all things are looked at as moral failures. That's what the immigration threshold is. Yes. I know your presentation is primarily on New Jersey, but do you have an idea of how many other states are moving acts like this forward? Significant amount, 5 or 6 so far. We have taken the most recent one happened out in Illinois, and that's in part as a reaction to the National Guard deployment that happened there. California, some states were proactive and they had some of these things in conjunction with their immigrant friendly policies. I just think that in the state of New Jersey, we believe in a lot of good still, and we probably did not really think about just solidifying things or ever seeing a point where we absolutely needed to defend ourselves and assert our state rights. So it's a different era, but yes, Illinois has one. I think North Carolina is currently fighting for one. New York might fall short this year, and then Oregon had a really good victory, and then California, I think, already has some of the provisions from a few years back. Minnesota has some of the Minnesota has, I don't know if they ever got it across the finish line, but they would have similar protections probably to what we have, or would be interested in having them. We also have to remember that we're in a very it's been a very heavy week for a lot of people in the immigration space. For anybody, I think, who has seen, you know, the shooting of a woman in broad daylight by a federal agent. And so I think that we're also in a moment where a lot of states who maybe did not think this posed a threat to their constituency is now very much a concern going forward, because the question really becomes, how do you hold a federal agent accountable in our court system? And we're all about to see that play out. Yes. I'll just go back and then I'll come back. Yes.
Yeah, I assume that there are other organizations working in the same area where you guys are and you coordinate So you can give us some sense of how large and diverse that group is?
I think the best part about these three bills specifically would be to look at the roster of people testifying. There were 60 organizations for the most part willing to testify on Monday on all these three bills. And that spans from, like I said, lots of service providers, healthcare clinic, community clinics, people in the law enforcement field, domestic violence, a lot of youth-centered ones, educators, laborers. So it's a large coalition of people that are working in the county. There are obviously groups like Casa Freehold that do a lot of really cool work. Um, we can have a conversation about some of the other providers in the area, but yeah, it's a this is an all hands on deck moment because there's few things that do not get impacted, whether it's your staff that's not going to be there, what it is for a lot of employers, or whether it is that you are just not going to be able to service the amount of residents you are supposed to be servicing by law because they're not showing up anymore. To give you a sense of what happens when immigration comes on premise, one of the things that I was very shocked by because they were able to statistically get a number was in North Carolina when they deployed. The first day, the school-wide attendance dropped by 31,000 students. So that's a crisis for a school system. Like, how often do you hold that for? And how sustainable is that? And that's really the conversation that we have with a lot of people. How sustainable? How many days a year can you have students drop off in 30, 20, 10,000 numbers and still pretend that it's just a regular day, right? At some point, all states will have to address what is currently happening. And it matters that we tell them how to address it. Yes.
I wonder what is the protocol for schools in Red Bank with ICE? We work right by the middle school.
The Department of Education issued guidelines, I believe, sometime in the summer. And the guidelines are something that every school in the state of New Jersey should be abiding by. Whether all schools know that and all districts know that, that's a different question. I know that in Red Bank they all do because I carried out the training. And the standard is, I think, fairly it makes sense. Obviously, if somebody wants to enter the building, there has to be specific people who are going to be able to make that decision. And we always talk to schools about having access to counsel on the phone because that's where I feel a lot of service providers and organizations are being put in between a hard and a rock place. There's a liability in you also cooperating more than you should have when it comes to this, hence why the privacy protection, right? You also don't want it to be the case that not just your immigration status, but in any form, information is being shared out with an agency or an agent that you did not clear first. And so in this scenario, it would strengthen their ability to really ask for a warrant in the upholding of that Fourth Amendment right. They always have, and you do. Every single one of you has the right to ask for a judicial warrant versus an administrative one, which oftentimes just has the Department of Homeland Security written at the top. But the schools know that they would have a designated, set of steps to follow and keep as much calm and safety as possible for students and families. Yes. Good.
Just a political question. With gerrymandering in the state of New Jersey, we've confronted like people like Chris Smith, who've been the longest running congressman
For a long
in the
time.
history, and we can't do much about it. And what can you do, or what do you do politically in order to get this stuff corrected?
That's a great question. I would say first thing is, and this is the hardest thing for me to accept, because immigration is obviously ultimately, like I said, the thing is, we didn't have to do any of this if the federal government had already put forth some kind of reform and a rational pathway for people, right? All this is because of that. So always call your representatives and yell at them and tell, not don't yell at them, but always call them and tell them that they really need to put an immigration reform through. They do. We're here. This is it. How much ground do we cede until we just finally accept what is the truth? And that is that we need a lot of our neighbors to stay and work and contribute and do all the things that they do for us on a daily basis. So on the federal end, I mean, there are newer champions or newer folks in there like Andy Kim and anyone who's a new representative, right? They all benefit of hearing that you care about the issue, right? The senator, as he starts to create his own identity in politics, right, of what he champions and doesn't, it helps when people tell you that's one thing as a Jersey resident I really care about. And so that would hopefully make him more bold. And he has a very unique tool here to use. And that is that he is one of the people that sanctioned Kristi Noem being the head of the Department of Homeland Security. He gave the granting winning vote. And then the second thing is that he has the ability to hold them accountable because he sits under the Department of Homeland Security Oversight Committee, right? So he has a real ability, and I've seen him do it, of having Kristi Noem in front of him or anybody else from CBP and say, what happened here, 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 and here. And that's what we need. What you and I cannot do is have the chance to ask them questions directly and FOIA them and bring the weight of a congressional office on them, but he does. Cory Booker has been a much better and obviously seasoned legislator, and he's very good usually on immigration, but it also depends on how the wind is blowing. And so you don't want to let it be up to when it's like the inevitable win for people to jump in. You always want them to help us carry the load because this is their job, right? We are doing their job. Their job is to explain to us what's going on in immigration, and they're not out here doing that. But on the state level, and that's why the biggest lesson is control what you can control. We can control Monday, right? We can control these protections. We can control this conversation. We can control the implementation and delivering of it. Obviously, we're seeing a new administration come into place, and they also need to hear that this is a thing that everyday New Jersey residents want. And it can be as simple. Here's the thing that I tell people when I work on immigration stuff. It can be that you call and you tell them what it is that you care about. You do not have to remember any of the stats, any of the very hard hitting points that you're like, well, that would make a strong point. If you want to have those points, more than happy to help. We're more than happy to provide information or details to people. But it can be as simple as saying, I do not want 33,000 of my local and state law enforcement to serve as immigration officers against my neighbors in schools. That's a very legitimate change in your reality. A few days ago, 3 days ago, we saw ICE officers get on a bus, a New Jersey Transit public bus, over in the Bergen line. Here's the thing that people miss from the beginning, and this has been my endless question for people that have been with me for years. They know this is the one thing I yap about all the time. 100 miles in of the perimeter of the US as a whole, 100 miles in, 2 out of 3 Americans live in a constitutional, questionable border zone, is what they call it. I say constitutional questionable because there is ideas, right? And you don't really have it consolidated until you really go to court. And that's the danger, the creation of a precedent law that will then carry with us for decades on forward after this episode. And what it says is that anything within 100-mile border, CBP has the ability to board, be part of, actively carry out immigration enforcement. CBP is the largest chunk of the immigration apparatus, and they're here and present in New Jersey because of the Elizabeth port and also the port of entry, right? We get a lot of shipments that come in to the state. We're an industrial warehouse state as well. And so there is precedent for CBP presence. There has been CBP presence, but having agents be able to get on buses day in and day out creates a different precedent for what your daily reality walking out of your house will look like going forward. Yes.
This is a bit of a global question. So this administration starts this immigration policy. What metrics can they point to and say, like, see, it's working? What do you feel are the metrics for doing that?
Um, the metrics that they point to are oftentimes their narrative they're supplementative to the narrative, right? There's a cherry picking of information. That's why there's a lack of transparency around information. But the metrics that they'll point to are very specific cases. We see that they like to highlight a particular case and blow it up. Like anything that happens down the street, you might get an evening comment by Trisha McLaughlin on it, or Todd Lyons, who are the two immigration top folks, and that's because they want to make a conclusion out of one individual or two individual cases. That is what we see, right? When you present them with the 73% of them have no criminal conviction, they're going to say that their criminal conviction was being here without papers. And so when you are not willing to abide by like core truths, it's much harder for you to be able to pin them. They cannot claim that there's a reduction in crime because we've been on a downward trend on crime. That's just a matter of fact. In all the states that they've tried to deploy, there's already been a drop once you step back. The one thing that they can say that they've done, because they have done it, is restrict legal immigration into this country, which was the dream. The dream was not so much to create, less undocumented people. The dream was to cut down the pathways into entry into the country. And the one thing I'll say, and we'll conclude maybe with that, is that when I was in DC last year, one of the things that stuck with me as I walked into the Holocaust Museum was a book of the amount of Jews that the American Foreign Service Committee, we've been around for 100 years, helped to flee to safety. One of the things that people oftentimes forget as to why asylum is such a core lesson for us collectively as a nation in the world is that we decided to create those laws after the Holocaust, when we realized that there should have been a pathway for people to flee. We have said that in this moment in time, America is literally no longer a place that you can flee to safety. And to me, it opens up bigger questions about our identity as a country, also our willingness as everyday citizens to let that become our new identity than it does about anything else. I believe, just like everybody in this room, I would assume, in a fair immigration reform pathway for people that have lived here for many, many years. I do not believe that the majority of Americans believe that we need an ethnic cleansing to be carried out in our name. I don't believe that. And you will never sell me on that, because what I read every day is not the reality on the ground. This is the reality on the ground. Overflowed rooms on a small presentation about immigration because people are deeply concerned and disturbed by what they're seeing. If you wonder what it is that I arm myself to go talk to my legislators, it is this. You tell me no one cares? Well, I'm telling you that's a lie. And it will be to their political, honestly, peril to think that this is not a moment where we are demanding courage out of our legislators. I talk to people in DC all the time and they're just like, I'm just a congressperson. I'm like, that is the wildest statement you can make. You're just a congressperson of the most powerful country on earth. You forgot that part. If you can't take a handle on the situation, the people will, and the people have, right? Ideally, if you ask me what kind of country I want to live on, one where we, after 30 years, decide that there's a pathway forward for our neighbors, where people can go ahead and find a way to register themselves and be able to live and coexist peacefully among us the way that we have forever. To me, to lose the identity as a nation of immigrants would be to lose the identity of America as a whole. I always tell my young people, I work with a lot of young people. I didn't say that. Lost in all this is the impact that it leaves on those young people. We had a young woman who testified for the Immigrant Trust Directive codification because she said that she has no one to come home to. Her father is not around, and her mother was just deported. And so she is an 18-year-old child that said something that I think is always going to stick with me, which is, I have no one to come home to. I have no one to eat dinner with. I have no one to say goodbye to me and good night. And no 18-year-old should ever have that happen in their own country against their family. And yet, and that's what I mean about the greatness of this country, she still felt, and come Monday, I pray that she will find herself redeemed. That the answer to lack of democracy is more democracy. The answer to lots of hate is lots of love. The answer to a lot of indifference is a lot of care. We have to show up every day. However your faith leads you or your lack of faith leads you. Whatever that is for you, whether that means you may disagree on the bigger things, let's continue to disagree on those things. But let's not disagree on how we treat human beings. that is dangerous to all of us. What you are willing to allow happen to somebody else, you're allowing that to happen to your family. For me, the idea that anybody is being taken to a third country without any information against court orders, it's not so much about the immigration case itself, but about the precedent that that sets for any American going forward. And so it really is, has to be a situation where it's like not in my name. And so with that, I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to stick around for any more questions. That's no problem for me.
Well, thank you very much, Itzel. I know you usually talk to people who are maybe more directly affected by what's been going on, but it's good to talk to a group like ours because I think we collectively can have a lot of local influence.
Absolutely.
By
I'm just going to do it because I know that you won't. American Friends Service Committee is the largest and only pro bono legal service provider
Yes.
for people going into deportation and non-resident. Every single service she just mentioned, they are the only group
Yeah.
that is providing those services in Montgomery County. She is the only person that is providing that training to the nonprofits. She trained this year over 300 nonprofits. Lunch Break, Fulfill, Parker, every single nonprofit you know.
Probably.
On what to do. The social services, the schools. If you want to know where you need to donate money to for this cause, you can donate directly to the Red Bank office of American Friends Service Committee. And it is going to go directly to funding the paralegals in that office, the new lawyer that we're hoping to get in that office, her job, and the youth organizer that's in that office is helping the youth get through this in RDR.
Yeah.
It is the best thing you could donate your money to right now. It's not your place to do that ask, but I'm going to do that ask. Because if you feel helpless, put your money in that program.
And then here are some red cards for anybody. I'm going to put them in that table who would like to carry them or pass them around to their neighbors. You're always welcome to do that.
And as I mentioned before, if you have any trouble getting information about what Itzel's been doing with information is this month's newsletter, and you can find it on the website, and then you can navigate and find out all about what's going on. So, okay, microphone. All right. Thank you all for coming out. We need to talk full time with us. Thanks for coming, and definitely